Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'as.
Hello there and welcome to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly talk show about European news. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thank you so much for tuning in. Coming up this week, do or die, the frank message Paris recently sent the EU. French President Emmanuel Macron warned that Europe is on the path to decline if it does not tackle authoritarian regimes and protectionism. As many here celebrate 20 years since the last big wave of enlargement, we ask if the bloc is up to the task of welcoming more. And this Friday, the world celebrated Press Freedom Day. But with newsrooms closing across the globe and independent journalists few and far between, there's not much cause for joy. From Bratislava to Rome, press freedom is coming under pressure in Europe, alarming given the big elections this year. Brussels has managed to pass a law to protect media independence. We hear how it will work with our panel this weekend. Olena Abramovich, Brussels correspondent for Ukrainian TV. Ricardo Borges de Castro, analyst in European and global affairs.
Hi.
And Dorota Bałacz, Polish correspondent for TV Poland. So lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's just hear first, though, what the EU Quarter of Brussels was talking about this week.
It's known as the Big Bang enlargement, 1st of May 2004, when 10 countries joined the EU. Shortly after, Romania and Bulgaria followed suit. Croatia too. After decades of communism, millions of people became members of a club based on democracy and a social market economy. It was good news for economic prospects and security, but the challenges were immense. 2 decades on, in a dramatically different world, the EU is getting ready to expand again. But with some saying that Europe needs to choose between a fast wake-up or a slow decline, we ask if the EU would be able to serve another enlargement wave.
So already 20 years since this Big Bang enlargement. Let's look at Dorota first. Remind us how it felt for you personally and, of course, for your nearest and dearest.
I think for people from my generation, people who are born in the 80s, in the 70s, enlargement is not only a political story, but it's a very personal story. And because we were there before being a part of Europe, and since 2 decades we are experiencing being in Europe. And I think everything changed. You know, I was a student, and I was actually already studying European integration when Poland was joining the EU. So what I was learning about just 3 years before was actually happening. So that was really amazing. And as soon as we joined the EU, I was, as many Poles, many young Poles, trying to get advantage of it. So actually I went on Erasmus program straight away to England, and actually I never came back to Poland, you know.
As you said yourself, it changed everything, so politically and also personally for Dorota. And of course, Ukraine has a very long border with Poland. So 20 years ago, was it something that you were keeping an eye on as well, that story? How did Ukrainians feel?
Well, I believe I was probably too young to keep an eye on that story, but basically I think Ukrainians were looking forward to it for many years, and just before the full-scale invasion, it felt like it's an aim which we are going to go for many more years, and was something like really distant, taking into account what was happening with other countries who were at the EU doors. Right now I hear discussions when people say that finally we believe that it's a reachable goal for our generation, actually.
And Ricardo, from your perspective as a political analyst, how do you believe Europe changed since this big wave of enlargement, for better and perhaps as well for worse for some?
I mean, I think some have already called it actually the first geopolitical enlargement of the EU. But I think it's really the political significance of that enlargement, of reuniting the continent. I think politically this has a huge significance, I believe. And also because it comes with a geographical expression, it is also of a geopolitical and geostrategic importance. So I think even though you can say say that the story has not always been rosy over the past 20 years. It has been a great story. I mean, I look at my country, we just celebrated 50 years of democracy and freedom, and Europe also played a key role in Portugal becoming a more democratic country. So I think, I mean, this is a success story.
Even though we do remember back then, well, some of us remember back then how there was a lot of criticism as well, or a lot of people reluctant to see that wave of enlargement. But again, in Brussels this week, there were a lot of smiles and a lot of celebrations about that anniversary. And Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, was in Strasbourg and saying that this wave was a win-win scenario for all.
In so many different ways, Europe has made you stronger, but you have made Europe so much stronger too. People and companies across Europe have enjoyed new opportunities to study and work, export and invest in a wider union. And let's stay ambitious on enlargement and reform. This is how we will make good on that European promise once again, just as we did 20 years ago. Long live the generation of 2004 and long live Europe. Thank you.
So, Dorota, this is your generation that she's, of course, alluding to. And how is trust today, 20 years later, between Poles and the establishments here in Brussels? And what bumps were there perhaps along the way?
I think this way was very bumpy, and straight from the beginning, I think Poland was thinking that Europe is only positive and we will be gaining everything, and they didn't realize enough that there are also expectations and obligations. So straight at the beginning, there were problems when the European Commission asked Poland to shut down the Polish shipyards because they were not competitive enough. There have been lots of problems linked to environment and climate requirements when Poland was always trying to put a brake on these ambitious EU plans from the very beginning. And finally, there were this ideological conflict because the Polish society is very conservative, and actually this led to the longer conflict in the future also with the former right government of Poland.
Yeah, a lot of bumps along the way, and inevitably could be a similar path for Ukraine when or if one day it does join the European Union. But do you feel encouraged by those words from the Commission President there, saying that enlargement needs to stay on track and we need to make good on these promises? Do you think the European Union will deliver here?
Well, I think Ukrainians are watching closely every step and every announcement and every phrase which is being pronounced in Brussels, and I'm frequently reporting on that. But I would also mention that actually the experts are right now looking at the Polish way, looking at which way Polish farmers actually were fighting for their rights and got into EU. So, I mean, this experience of Poland and all those countries which joined before Ukraine is being deeply discussed right now, analyzed to see which way Ukraine can also progress, because I think on political level there is understanding that this is also a bumpy road where you have to kind of look closely and fight for your own benefits and rights.
And of course, Ricardo, elections are coming up. They're just around the corner here for the European Parliament. Do you think EU enlargement is very present in manifestos for the political groups? I don't think,
enlargement, or I would say Ukraine and the problems, or the war and what revolves around enlargement, whatever is happening in Georgia. I think these issues are looked upon, but I'm not convinced that in many countries, particularly in mine, enlargement has not been a big topic of campaign. Okay, the campaign is about to start, so I'm actually curious to see whether enlargement will feature very high. I think probably the Commission will try to have these frameworks of negotiation, approved in the June Council. That's what I hear, but I don't think that this probably is going to be sort of a topic of high discussion, maybe more on what might be some of the risks or some of the costs that this, because as both were saying, this is not a cost-free process, for those that want to come in and for those that are already here. So I think this might be but I think it might be niche in some respects.
And is corruption being addressed adequately, do you think, in Ukraine? Is that something that you report on?
corruption in Ukraine, you mean? The view of European Union on the corruption in Ukraine, of course, is always being discussed. But I think right now, during the war, the big accent is actually on watching what is the EU reaction on the reforms, what are being done in Ukraine. It's very broad field of the aspects, and I wouldn't say that corruption is like on the flag. I mean, from what I see being discussed in the media, it is mentioned, but it is mentioned with some other structural reforms in the country.
And interesting how you say that your country is looking towards Poland for some tips as well on that long and bumpy road.
The other way around also, the European Union institutions are actually, you know, also thinking about what happened with this Big Bang enlargement, where are the problems, and they are trying to be a bit more proactive and to avoid the same scenario with Ukraine.
To avoid the same scenario with Ukraine. And just briefly on the currency, because you still have the zloty, but obviously one day you're obliged, I suppose, to have the euro. That will, of course, come with economic hardship for Poles. How do they feel about that?
Yeah, but there is, at the moment, there is still not big support for euro in Poland. We were quite close with the first Donald Tusk government to start the way to implement the common European currency. It was back in 2007. But then financial crisis happened, actually, and we found out that not being in the Eurozone was an advantage.
Yeah.
And actually, since that moment, we, instead of going closer, we actually got back, and at the moment there is not a big will for euro, because actually after the last 8 years of quite Eurosceptic government in Poland, we need to first work to reintroduce the pro-European moods.
It's like you're starting from scratch, right? It's like a rebirth in Poland. Well, 20 years ago when the EU did enlarge, the Irishman Pat Cox was the president of the European Parliament then, and we checked in with him this week to hear what that moment was like and if, in his eyes, the EU is ready to enlarge again.
It was a very special day, a sense of a moment of reunification, and to borrow the words of the late Pope John Paul II, a day when Europe could breathe on both its lungs, east and west. I think we're living in very different times. This model that we've worked in is under stress from the outside and the inside. I don't believe the enlargement will happen in the course of the next 5 years, but if it's to happen soon after that, it will happen on the foundations being laid in the coming period and mandate of the European Parliament and the next European Commission.
So Pat Cox there speaking to me earlier this week, the former president of the Parliament. Would you agree, Ricardo, with that statement that the next 5 years, the upcoming commission would really prepare those stepping stones for more countries?
I mean, I think there's no other option. If enlargement is to be serious and if it's seen as a priority for the EU, that's what the Commission needs to do. I think it needs to take enlargement as a serious policy and priority, also with all the implications that it has in all policy areas that we know and we just mentioned some of them. So I think we need to take this very seriously, also because it's about the credibility of the EU globally, because in a sense, I mean, there's a war going on in Ukraine. There's a war in the battlefield. This is the other side of the coin. Is really, it's the fight also for the political and for our union, in a sense where, you know, these countries, in my view, also belong. So this, I think, if this is of this strategic nature, then the Commission needs, and the Commission, and not only the member states, we need to prepare for this.
So we'll keep an eye as well on who is appointed as the commissioner in charge of that portfolio. But we know that Montenegro is hoping to be the next member in 2028. They have just over 500,000 population. But Dorota, from your perspective, do you think the EU needs to reform internally first?
I think this process should be done at the same time as getting closer with Ukraine. And actually, in my opinion, it has to be done. I cannot imagine this Europe of over 30 member states, which has to decide unanimously on everything. I mean, we have a perfect example with Viktor Orban, that it doesn't work, and it actually paralyzed the work of the European Union institutions. And I cannot imagine in the future, in this enlarged Europe, that Bosnia and Herzegovina or Serbia is blocking some important decisions. So I think these reforms have to be done. But for sure, the Eurosceptics already used that story to scare the society about even bigger sovereignty loss. The European Union institutions should think how to address this, how to do that. I've actually learned from some MEPs that maybe these changes can be introduced in the accession treaty of Ukraine. And like that, the EU treaties don't have to be changed. It can be done either way.
I'm sure that would be something you would welcome, because if you needed to wait for the EU to reform itself.
Yeah, we've heard many times from Ukrainian foreign minister that Ukraine shouldn't be a hostage of this reforming process, meaning that Ukraine shouldn't be blocked because EU is waiting to reform itself, that those should be the processes with go in parallel, but not blocking each other. And it's not only a reform of decision taking, it's also an agricultural reform to be able to absorb such a huge market which Ukraine has with agriculture, to reform the subsidies, etc. So it's really a great piece of work, but of course Ukrainians are hoping that this work won't be a barrier on their way to joining EU.
I'm curious how you say Ukrainians are following every word that's uttered out of this town. But just on what Pat Cox there said about Europe being stressed from the inside and also from the outside, I think that's interesting given as well the recent speech from the French President Emmanuel Macron. 1.5 hours he delivered a speech to the University of Sorbonne, reminding us here in Europe that it's mortal and we could potentially die depending on our choices. Macron also added that there's a huge risk that we will be weakened, that the rules of the game have changed. Would you agree with this wake-up call, Ricardo?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think actually to a certain extent, the Europe that we knew already died on the 24th of February 2022 when Russian tanks crossed Ukrainian borders. So, I mean, okay, it comes already from 2014. But to a certain extent, that Europe, that world ended on that day. So I think now, I think that this speech is a good speech, maybe lengthy, as you said, probably too detailed in some parts. It's almost like the State of the Union speech plus the Commission work program put together. So it can be very detailed, but it's really, he focused on 3 key points, which is power, prosperity and people. And these are the 3 conditions for the EU if we really want to be a geopolitical union. These are the areas. I mean, as I've said many times, he's really the think tanker in chief at the EU level. You know, among European leaders, there's not so many leaders that think as much as profoundly as he does. I think the reverse side is that he, as a think tanker, is not very successful when he's a president, because he, as a president, does not always follow what he says as a think tanker. So I think there's also a need for the French also to be more assertive when they put out the ideas. Then they also need to give the example. And I'm particularly on Ukraine. I think they could be supporting much more Ukraine than they are, for example.
Well, indeed, back home, he's not doing so well. And whether or not young people would have tuned into that 1.5 hour speech and then eventually vote for people to similar views to him for the political elections or the European elections coming up remains to be seen. But on that note of him being seen as this kind of European statesman, would that be your impression from Poland?
What impression? In what
The impression that Emmanuel Macron is this kind of European statesman with these great ideas that people will turn around and listen to, or he's not taken seriously at all?
Yeah, I think he was addressing the domestic public first of all, and we all know that actually the Euroscepticism in France is huge. We don't talk about it so much, but I think France is at the moment one of the countries where the support for Europe is the smallest one. So maybe he was actually using this kind of wording to get popularity, which is maybe not the most clever thing to do. But this kind of criticism I find quite constructive for Europe, finally. Last time he criticized NATO, actually a few years ago. He said that NATO is experiencing cerebral death. Mm-hmm. And ever since, also with other criticism of Trump, the member states of NATO started to spend more on defense, which is also linked to the war in Ukraine.
So maybe these words could have an impact. What was the take from Ukraine on that speech, or did it make it that far?
Well, of course, Ukrainians are following also speeches of Emmanuel Macron, also taking into account his recent words that he doesn't exclude bringing troops to Ukraine, for example, which also made a lot of noise in Ukraine. I wouldn't say that this last speech was followed that closely, maybe because it was also focusing a lot of European politics, etc., etc. But the very first point he mentions when he say about the deaths of possible deaths of Europe is defense, and this issue, the issue of defense, is being actually followed by Ukrainian audience. Ukrainian government was also emphasizing that it's a time actually to move to this new strategic.
Okay. I'm going to have to bring that discussion to an end on that conclusion, but do stay with us here on Euronews, because after the break we'll be digging into a very gloomy report on dwindling press freedom in Europe. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon. Now, this week the world marked International Press Freedom Day to shed light on the plight of the press globally. Here in Europe, press freedom is fairly good in Norway, Ireland, Denmark. That's according to Reporters Without Borders. But the situation is worrying in Greece, where journalists have been spied on by powerful spyware. Slovakia is a case for concern, with reports that the government is trying to take control of the state broadcaster. And this week, Italian students interrupted their classes to read excerpts from a famous author that were censored by the national broadcaster RAI. So I'd like to ask you first, have you been following these trends? Are they a big cause for concern? Dorota?
It's very worrying. At the same time, unfortunately, it's not very surprising. I think the democracy in Europe is not living its best days at the moment, and media freedom is one of the victims of it.
And attacks against journalists increasing.
And attacks against journalists. I mean, me myself, I experienced that on many occasions, and
online and offline.
Of course, of course.
Because online as well can be horrific. What about the situation in Ukraine, the state of press freedom there? Have you ever been censored?
If my media is present there, I work for Radio Free Europe. That means that in the country there are some problems with media freedom, because, for example, in EU countries it's only in Hungary and Romania where Radio Free Europe is present. So basically, of course, yes, we do experience from time to time. Usually it happens during election campaigns. We have cases, we remember in our history cases when journalists had to, the anchors had to address the public after the elections and apologize, for example, for being not very trustful, etc. So, I mean, journalists, they also work with their faces, it's their reputation. And if politicians would change every certain number of years, for journalists, it's always important to keep the trust of their audience and to stay very firm and independent. And if such episodes happen during elections, of course, it's very harmful for the trust to the media itself in general.
Well, the European Union now has, after years of negotiations, a media law that aspires to protect journalists and the press from political and economic interference. The Romanian MEP Ramona Strugariu is the lady who was in charge of the file, and she told me that getting this regulation across the line was historical. Take a listen.
This is happening after very long negotiations. It is happening after years when journalists were harassed and where we have definitely seen monopoly and interference, and where we didn't understood enough that basically free media is the fourth pillar of an independent and democratic state. From now on, we will have sanctions for those like Mr. Jansa or Mr. Orban, who are refusing to understand the significance and the meaning of free media and ensuring that there's no interference, political or of any kind, in the work of a journalist.
So Ramona Strugariu there saying that this law sends a message to anyone who wants to transform their state media into a propaganda tool, spread fake news or destabilise democracy. Ricardo, do you think this will work, this Media Freedom Act?
I think it depends also, I think it has to do with enforcement, whether these violations do happen and then whether there is a way to enforce the rules. I mean, I think we need to retain, as Dorota was saying, the trends all over the world are negative in terms of democracy or freedoms. In Europe, we do better than in most places, but in some places we are not doing well. And so I think what we need to retain is the possibility that journalists can independently and freely speak truth to power, can investigate, can question politicians and those that are in power in about what they're doing. And so I think we need to retain this possibility, because this is an essential pillar of our democracies. It's like one of the lungs as well of how democracies actually work. So I think media freedom is really a fundamental principle.
And Dorota, does it make you feel safer having this Media Freedom Act? And also tell us about the situation in your country with the state broadcaster, which you've just recently joined again.
Yeah, I don't know how it will work. We will see, as Ricardo said, how the reinforcement will be. I'm not sure that it will stop the politicians to nominate the boards and management in the national public media, and I think this is the biggest problem regarding the public state media, that it is the politicians who decide who will govern them and what will be the coverage afterwards. And also, I think in this act, the spying of journalists is finally not forbidden. I was spied here in Brussels as a correspondent. My conversations were recorded and played back to me. Apparently this spyware was not working so well, so it was easy to discover it. So we will see. I mean, it's good that the European politicians are finally doing something about it, but I think in the future this legislation will probably have to be improved to be really efficient.
And have you been reporting on the situation in Slovakia, or the situation as well this week in Italy with RAI being censored? Or
We haven't been reporting on that, but I should also mention that right now in Ukraine, for example, all the biggest TV channels, they work all together. We have this United News Marathon, which is being a bit criticized also by international observers, that all the biggest TV channels, they are united, and they kind of, in times of war, are being used to on the one hand, to calm down people. On the other hand, there are questions how independently those all journalists can work, and if it's probably a time to let all those TV channels to work freely, everyone for themselves, but not to be maybe influenced by the office of president. So in Ukraine there are also discussions. No one has the certain answer, because we are in times of war, and which is the correct way to work. But I would say that analysts, they are looking closely to this media reform in EU being introduced, and there are big hopes also to have it established in Ukraine, and to finally have some kind of independent public television, if that is possible anyhow.
Okay, we'll keep an eye on that. And just very briefly, fake news, disinformation, also rampant, a key challenge as well coming up to these elections.
I mean, I think it does also because it happens also on social media, which is much harder to control, right? And I mean, the stories of these bots that you try to take them down and they appear immediately. And also this, I mean, the new frontier is really these deep fakes, which will be very hard, or the damage can be done, a lot of damage, before you actually identify or confirm that it's a deep fake. So I think we are entering in a new media space that is very difficult also to control and to try to make sense of.
Indeed. And there was a number of fake accounts about me on Instagram, TikTok in the last couple of weeks. So do watch out for them and make sure that the person you are speaking to via private message is really that person. Thank you so much to our panellists. The topic we will definitely come back to. And thank you so much for watching. See you soon on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with my panel, we're taking a look at the news of the week. And one story that turned our heads was this: Turkey looking for special EU protection for its famous snack, the doner kebab. It would make it the very first Turkish product to get such recognition. Have you even heard about this story? Has it got into your radar there, Ricardo, this week?
No, I mean, it was a total surprise, and probably, I mean, I think why not? Probably this won't make me many friends in Greece. I mean, I like very much Turkey. I live there as a student, so it's I would say emotionally, yes. Why not doner kebab becoming a demarcated product in Turkey?
Well, you were surprised, and you're not the only one, because of course 500,000 Turks live here in Brussels, and most born here, and of course that means that we have a very vibrant Turkish quarter here in Brussels with many kebab shops. So we went down to pay them a visit to ask them how they felt about this potential new endorsement that will also perhaps come with more rules and regulations. Take a listen.
There are several ways of making doner. For us, it wouldn't change much, but other restaurants might not accept these new rules because they would no longer be able to call their product doner kebab. They buy doner that arrives frozen, and then you don't know how it's made. That's the problem. I don't think these new rules will have too much of an impact on us, but if they do, we'll have to adapt. They have to be minimum standard rules, but it shouldn't go overboard either.
So many there not quite sure either why their government applied for this status. Have you been keeping an eye on this?
Well, for me, it's probably another case to watch because we have Ukrainian borscht, which is also being discussed, and there is powers from Russia who are trying to call this dish Russian, etc. So
But we have it in Poland too.
See, I love it.
This is the issue which just brought into my mind this issue of Ukrainian borscht and to follow how it works. And
seemingly, de Rota, in Poland, you have these Saint Martin's croissants that have this special protective status. Yeah? Are they amazing? No.
I don't like very sweet things, but yeah, we usually eat them in November, and it's a nice tradition. Yeah, but actually, with the Turkey story, I was surprised. To be very honest, I didn't know that a country that is a candidate can already apply for this protection.
Well, actually, I think it's back since 1992 that the EU set up this special protection scheme as a way to safeguard and promote local agriculture and heritage. And you don't have to be an EU member. Seemingly, there's even Vietnamese fish sauce that have this special status. Ricardo.
I mean, I think it's great that if the EU is also helping others preserve their cultural identity we all, I think in all our countries, we have the stuff that we want to protect, also because it speaks to our traditions, speaks to our regions even sometimes. So I think why not? I don't think that this is a big deal, and kudos for the Turks to have gone ahead with this.
And of course, this is a massive industry as well. We're talking about 3.5 billion euro. That is what the doner kebab economy is worth here in Europe. That's according to the Association of Turkish Doner Producers. So there's a lot at stake here as well for their economy.
I think probably yes. I mean, I don't do this anymore, but when I was in uni as a grad student, there was not an evening out that would not end up in a kebab van. So I think that, kebab plays a role also not only in Turkey, but plays a role in all European societies as well, I would say.
And I don't agree quietly with Ricardo, because I think that Europe probably maybe should be a bit more protective. Maybe we are too good, and that's why all the problems with China, and Chinese
but that's a different conversation.
Products. And Turkey is not is a very awkward partner. It's a candidate state since 1999. It's negotiating its membership since 2005, and maybe it should be good if Ankara started to implement EU requirements and obligations and not asking for the privileges.
Good conclusion there from de Rota, because indeed those discussions when it came to a session were blocked for a couple of years. So the forum that they even had to talk ceased to exist. But on that conclusion, that brings our show to an end. Thank you so much to Olena Abramovich, Ricardo Borges de Castro and de Rota Babovic. And thank you so much for watching. If you would like to reach out to us here, our email address is brusselsmylove@euronews.com. You can also private message us on social media, but make sure it's really us that you're speaking to. Take care and see you soon.